What are you doing?
Nothing. What's the matter to you?
What are you looking for? Get out of that dumpster.
I got it. It's a super awesome handout about writing assessments. Come on, I'll tell you all about it.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Oh, hey. You guys made it. Come on in.
And on today's episode of Between Two Blue Shiny Christmas Trees, you're going to cover this writing assessment material for us.
Thanks, Jim. For lack of a better term, I will be today's expert on writing assessment. For the first part of this Be the Expert presentation, the topic we will define is literacy. To truly go through writing assessment, we need to understand literacy. But before I really dive into it, I need everybody to know, because I know you all read the reading thoroughly for this presentation, is that all this information comes from Miss Unger's paper about types of literacy assessment, principles, procedures, and application, steps to success. Easily Googled. So when I reference all this stuff, came directly from that paper. So here's a huge overview for you guys. Number one, literacy. Now I got it broken down into 1 and 2, because at first one might think literacy is only the ability to read and to write. But as mentioned in the paper, it goes beyond the ability to read and write to listening, speaking, viewing, and performing. So being truly literate is to be able to perform in all these abilities. So, now that we've defined literacy, given credit where credit's due, we can move on to talking about the assessment portion. Mentioned early in the paper, but Munger quickly identifies assessments to be truly effective must be multidimensional and authentic. Now, as we know, as we move through this program, things that are multidimensional and authentic, things that provoke inquiry, types of situations we can put students in that gets them beyond those oversimplified questions. Munger talks about simple multiple choice questions being not as effective, and that type of testing maybe not being as effective. So a good assessment are types of questions that are going to take us into this realm of thinking and avoid oversimplified questions, things that students can just rattle off. The big point she makes is there's really no bad type of test. It all relies on that type of question that we're asking the student. So as long as it's not oversimplified, as long as they can get into that part of their brain where they're critically thinking, then our assessments are going to become multidimensional and authentic, and we can hope that students are not just rattling off facts, regurgitating facts or information that they're going to soon forget once the test is over or the assessment's done. So, now that we understand that assessments must be multidimensional and authentic, and that types of questions are what we're looking for, those good questions about writing, we can move on to our first couple types of assessment. Now, as we know, we've talked about this in every subject, not just EDLL, is we have formative assessments and summative assessments. Now, this paper breaks it down really nice because formative is to form. We're forming a plan for future learning. We're forming a plan to improve upon students' writing. So taking an example right from the paper is formative literacy assessment might involve a classroom teacher checking how many letters and sounds her students know as she plans decoding lessons. So once that teacher has found out how many of these letters and sounds students know, she can now make a plan as to what types of lessons she needs to do moving forward and what types of assessments she must use moving forward. And all teachers, not he or she, the paper used is a female example. And then moving along to our other type, summative assessment, is to sum up. We want to know how much have the student learned. So we want to summarize the extent to which students surpass a certain level of proficiency. And these come at an endpoint of instruction. A good example is like a provincial exam or a test at the end of a unit. Things of that nature that are going to say, hey, is this student proficient enough in that skill that we can move along? Or do we need to readjust, recalculate our projection and spend an extra week on some of that knowledge and maybe dial it back to more of these formative assessments so we can now form a new plan moving forward. So both these tests work hand in hand. We have talked a lot about summative being kind of that old school type of assessment, but I think the more and more we do this, we realize you're always assessing, you're always formatively assessing, and there is a point where we are going to have to use summative assessment, especially in writing, to know if a kid or a student is proficient enough to move into that next level, or do we need to dial it back so they don't get lost as we move forward. So moving on from formative and summative assessments, we are going to talk about literacy screenings and diagnostic literacy assessment. Much more specific types of assessment and used in a different variety of ways. Screenings are typically given to all members of a population, but I guess we could relate it to as like a medical screening. If you've ever answered a long questionnaire trying to get down to the root of a problem, trying to figure out your background, things like that. So it's given to all students, or in medical sense, all patients, but in our sense, all students. And it's to identify potential problems that may not be recognized during day-to-day interactions. So these could be deeper-seated writing problems that are maybe coming up as a different issue, and things of that nature. Moving along to diagnostic literacy assessment. Oh, sorry, just to backtrack a second. On literacy screening, if you go to the reading, there is a pretty interactive table about different types of literacy screenings. They are from American educational institutes, but that's fine. It gives you an idea of maybe if you want to use it, you can create your own screenings, different things of that nature. It's table 1 from the reading. So now, diagnostic literacy assessments. These seem a little bit more intense, but I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the paper exactly to explain what it is. Diagnostic tests are generally not administered to all students, but they're reserved for students whose learning needs are being unmet. So we're trying to figure out what level of intervention we need to take as educators to figure out how we can move this student along and get them up to adequate reading and writing levels. Diagnostic literacy assessments typically involve the use of standardized tests administered individually to students by highly trained educational specialists, such as our reading teachers or EAs, special educators, speech and language pathologists, school psychologists. So I think it's more of a one-to-one thing, or a small group of students need to do it to really get to the root of a problem, and then I guess maybe we solve the problem and move along, or we need to take further steps to get the student to where they need to be reading or writing, or maybe there's a deeper root to the problem. So the assessments include subtests focused on specific components of literacy, such as word recognition, decoding, reading comprehension, both spoken and written language. And then the results from a diagnostic assessment, they can be used formatively to, again, form that plan to improve the student's learning on reading and writing, and to give us different means of intervention so that we can get the student responding adequately. And the results can be combined with other assessments, and we can really figure out if this student has an educational disability and they require special attention, Or is there steps that we can take inside the school to get this student to an adequate reading and writing level? That one's pretty complicated. Again, reading that straight from the paper might give you better information, but that's my spiel on diagnostic literacy assessment. Next up are single point estimates. First topic on the board here. This is a one-time assessment to explore a student's learning at an exact point in the school year. Example, student's word identification score from a diagnostic achievement test. And this allows educators to know if a student is proficient in an area or if they need to explore the root of a low score, knowing that there could be outliers or different situations of a low score, but we could explore it anyways. Moving along to progress monitoring, literacy assessment. So progress monitoring assessments provide educators with a baseline or the starting point of a student's achievement, along with periodic reassessment as the student is progressing toward learning outcomes. This assessment, which I thought was really interesting, provides educators with an outlook of where a student might run into problems as the school year progresses and as learning progresses. I think that's why the reassessment is so important. Again, in the paper, if you go to figure 2, it has a really in-depth look at progress monitoring and has a bunch of arrows and headers of things hitting different points and different projections of where a student might go wrong. That would be a great thing to go look at to explore it deeper. Although effective, this type of assessment can be vague as to what exactly the student's struggling with. Is it the instruction or is it the means of intervention being used to try to correct the reading or writing problem? So, 2 different types of assessment mentioned early in the paper, but very similar to our formative and summative assessments. Actually, I've included that here as it's a little bit of a confusion, but each one goes with different things. So formal assessment can be considered summative. It's things like our end of unit exams, provincial exams, things of that, assessments of that nature. Our informal is going to be more of a formative exam. It's things like observation, journaling, different things that go on throughout the day at school that educators are paying attention to, seeing if students are understanding. It includes a multitude of assessments. Like I said, it's mentioned earlier in the paper. It's not on my super awesome handout because I've thought formative and summative assessments covered it pretty thoroughly, and they fall underneath that category. But there is a portion of Munger's paper that we all read for this that does talk about these 2 things, throwing it in here. But it does, formal is summative, informal is formative. So let that confuse you a little bit, but that is another 2 different ways to refer to assessments. So next up, as we get through the paper, get down the list here of the super awesome handout about writing assessment, we are on to linking assessment to intervention. The fact that this paper uses the word intervention kind of throws me off and makes it sound really intense. Maybe it's because I spent lots of my childhood watching Intervention, but it's not the same. Anyways, we're talking about writing intervention. So how educators are trying to intervene, trying to make a student better. I feel like there's a lot of different words you can use. I feel like coming at a parent or someone with intervention is a little intense. Anyways, that's up to you. Educators use a variety of assessment techniques to determine a student's strengths and needs. So we're going to continue to use a multitude of strategies and assessments to figure out what a student needs to be better and how we can form a better plan. Maybe just drop intervention and form a plan. I consistently want to use language that is trying to make us better, not trying to intervene or do something to that extent. That's just one man's opinion. Anyways, next down the board is reliability of our assessments. So straight from the paper here is A reliable assessment means that the information gathered is consistent and dependable. Consistent and dependable. That the similar results would be obtained if the student were assessed on a different day by a different person or using a similar version of the same assessment. Pretty basic. Understanding of reliability. You need reliability through everything. I guess things that take away is the ability to copy, the ability to cheat through a test, cheat through an assessment. Things like that are going to take away from your reliability. And then validity of an assessment. So it measures the assessment, if it is valid, measures what it's supposed to measure. You're not finding out an array of different results from that test that might not be valid in what you're trying to find. I feel like most assessments are valid in some way. I figure even if the goal was to achieve one thing, but you started to find out other things, it'll lead you to be able to form another plan for another assessment to figure out that thing, or maybe you realize that it's valid in a different way and you can use it in a different space the next time. So those are the basics of reliability and validity. Well, now that we've made it to the final minutes of my presentation, we've got to cover some controversies. You heard? Just messing with you guys. Anyway, some controversies, yeah, of writing assessment. So there is the simple controversy of over-testing. Too many tests, stressing kids out, too many formal means of assessment, too many of those provincial exams, gathering tons of data and then never utilizing that data was a controversy taken from Munger's paper. This high-stakes testing one was huge. So those provincial exam situations, those big end-of-unit tests that are stressed, we've all done them, we've all been there. They cram you into the school cafeteria, unsaid teacher's name gets mad at you for asking what the day is and kicks you out of the test. Never happened to me. Things that stress kids out are going to make that high-stakes testing. It can make the results not even reliable because of how stressed the student can get, those test anxieties. You're dealing with all things like that. So I think along with writing assessment, but every type of assessment, those situations put pressure, and if kids aren't used to that, then it's almost unfair to the student to stick them in there and do things like that, pull them out of that environment where they're comfortable, like the classroom, and stick them in a different space to do these high stakes tests. Flip it over, don't look around, slide the test over, I'll meet you in the alley with the results type deal. It's a little intense. And Munger's paper says that can skew results big time, and it is a huge controversy in assessment. And then the last controversy from Munger's paper is, I took it as the ability of the educators. Our last point here, literacy assessments can only be used to improve outcomes for students if educators have deep knowledge of research-based instruction, assessment, and intervention, and can use that knowledge in their classrooms. So I think that's the ability of us as educators to be able to have the knowledge to know what the test results are telling us, what does that data show, how do we use that data moving forward, and how do we go back to that formative assessment and form this new plan. So if you have undereducated educators trying to teach people writing assessment, or incapable educators doing it at the wrong level, at the wrong time, then that data could be completely skewed, or if a teacher doesn't know how to do it. But I think that's why, especially in our program and the places that we've been, there's such a good, healthy community of educators trying to work together. Nobody's there trying to make a student worse. Just like in every aspect of life, if you're not doing something that's going to make you better, why do it, right? If it's going to take away from that, then you should reassess how you're assessing. So the ability of educators to use your community, if you're not understanding results, and move forward, taking steps of that nature is very important, especially when we're taking care of the future. So those are the big major controversies from Munger's paper. That's going to sum up my super awesome handout about writing assessment. And thank you all for listening to me talk for 20 minutes. I hope it was as fun for you as it was for me. Keep on rocking in the free world, brother. So this concludes Mr. Bigham's Be the Expert on Writing Assessment. Hope this gave you a few laughs and some knowledge while we're all quarantined, staying no less than 6 feet away. That concludes this episode of Between Two Blue Shiny Christmas Trees. And I hope to see you around. Let's hope practicum works out, and we'll go from there. Thanks for listening to my TED.
Plus I can't turn the swell off. Franchise doing big business. I live this, it's automatic. I win this, so you